Hello and welcome. My name is Georgia Pugh. This is AWI Extension WA's Making Sense of Carbon and Emissions webinar that you've joined today. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available following this live event. In today's webinar, we'll be hearing from expert Richard Brake of Richard Brake Consulting and Esperance Region wool grower Bruce Pengilly of Penrose Pastoral. Each presenter will be sharing their tips and experiences with carbon and emissions to help you better understand carbon and emissions and how to get started on your farm. You will be given the opportunity to ask a few questions at the conclusion of each presentation, and both speakers will be hanging around at the end of the webinar for a bit more discussion and Q&A then too. Feel free to put through your questions in the chat anytime, and please turn off your mic and ask a question if you'd like to as well during question time. But yeah, otherwise, please feel free to use that chat at any time. So we don't get any interruptions, please make sure that you are on mute unless you're asking a question during question time. And feel free to turn on your video so we can see that there's actual human beings at the end of this webinar. So fantastic if you want to. Okay, that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Richard Brake of Richard Brake Consulting now. Thank you, Richard. If you're there, please come off mute and yeah, I've got your video on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Georgia. And thanks to AWI for the opportunity to present on this webinar. Today, going to have a chat around making sense of carbon and emissions on farm, and only 30 minutes, which for a very detailed big subject, so we're going to move quite quickly through a lot of the slides. And what I'm going to do is just give you an overview of the why it's important from a farmer's perspective, a producer's perspective, why they need to be paying attention in this space, and then also working through some of the calculators, how I use the data, and then finishing up with where I think this is likely to go at some point in the future. So for me, starting with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that were that the United Nations has put together, and we're starting to see these on a lot of annual reports from multinational companies. And really, for me, they're primarily 6 as agricultural producers that need to be aware of. Number 2, zero hunger. Number 6, clean water. Number 7, oh sorry, not number 7, number, oh, I can't read it on my screen. Number 13, the climate action. Number 15, life on the land. And then there is one around there about social justices and that sort of thing. So these really driving internationally a multinational, a company's social license to operate. And we're going to start to hear a lot more around these in ESG statements, so environmental, social governance statements. And I'll show you some of the websites with companies that you're likely to deal with their goals and objectives. Moving on, the government and supply chain signals. Hopefully you're all aware with Australia's national target of a 43% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050 came out of COP21. 196 countries agreed to limit global warming to an increase of 1.5 degrees on 2005 levels. Australia agreed, I think it was about 22%, something like that. The Labor government, when they came to power, increased that to 43%. And one of the things people quite often say to me is that with Trump in the White House, change of government earlier on this year, potentially when there was a federal election, even though it didn't, but if there is a change of government, then all of these targets might change. Hopefully what I'm going to show to you in the next couple of slides is that it's not governments that are driving this. It is multinationals and lenders, and being driven by investors and shareholders as well. So multinational companies are needing to reduce their environmental impact, driven by shareholder and consumer demand. And financiers are also coming that under the same pressure as well, that shareholders want to invest responsibly and want to ensure that their money, where they put it, is invested responsibly from that ESG, environmental social governance perspective. out of approximately 100 of the world's biggest economies, approximately 69, I think, of them are multinational companies and not governments. So they have a very strong requirement, demand from their shareholders to manage this perspective. Wrong piece. Moving on to the next slide. So in terms of supply chain emissions reduction commitments, you see on the slide there, these are the commitments by some of the bigger companies. Nestle there, for example, 50% by 2030, net zero by 2050. I'll pull out Fonterra there, 30% emissions intensity by 2030 from a 2018 baseline. And Ingham's as well, 43% by 2030, net zero by 2050. And so these companies are all starting to work with their supply chain in reducing their emissions and how they achieve these targets. Heineken net zero by 2030, and that's the carbon neutral malt barley into the malt chain there. And Rabo and NAB that hold 50% of the Australian agri-debt market both have net zero financed emissions targets by 2050. So all of these companies are going to start looking through their supply chain at how do we reduce these emissions, and coming back to producers and saying, what are your current emissions and how are we going to reduce those? So showing on to some of the, pulled these off the website, off these websites last week. I haven't got a wool one on here, sorry, but I've got on the left-hand side bought malt there, malt barley, Maltster. They've got their objectives, and as you can see, they've got their UN Sustainable Development Goals listed on their website, and they have pathways at how they're going to reduce those. On the right-hand side is from JBS website and their sustainability commitments and the pathways that they're going to take, along with the UN sustainability goals that they're aiming to achieve by reducing that. And they've all got pathways as how they're going to reduce their impact in that space. And then bringing it a little bit closer to home, the top left corner there, you have the Woolworths website, and the bottom right-hand corner there, you have the Coles website and the sustainability goals that they are aiming to have an impact on within their supply chain. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that within your supply chain, and wool is no different either, your supply chain has commitments towards reducing their impact on these sustainable development goals of the UN and how they're going to achieve them, and starting to work with their producers. A lot of the companies are still in the pilot phases. Not too much has been taken direct to market as a mainstream, but they are all in that space and working on it. Turning to the finance companies, and the start of this year, 1st of January, new laws were brought in for financial climate reporting, and this is for companies from the 1st of January 2025 that have consolidated revenue of $500 million or more, assets of 1 billion or more, or full-time employees equivalents of 500 or more, and any two of those three criteria, need to report their climate-related risk exposure to APRA. Now, this pulls in the big four banks, Coles, Woolworths, and all of major supply chain players. And there are some steps that are taken down in that bill in 2026, getting to a position on 1 July 2027 where they're targeting companies that have revenue of $50 million or more, assets of $25 million or more, or 100 full-time equivalent employees or more. So really tightening that the belt on who needs to report their climate-related risk exposure to APRA and what they're doing about it. And so if we move then to some of the websites, if my clicker works. Oh, sorry, first off, before I get to the websites. So I borrowed this slide from Richard Eckhart from the University of Melbourne. This was a Collier protein producer index report and a question on institutional investors' attitudes to risk for investment into livestock-related companies. If I draw your attention to the left-hand side, I've highlighted a box there. That is Fonterra. So investors felt that Fonterra had a really good handle on their ESG commitments and reducing their impact on environment. In the middle, the box highlighted in red there, that is Ingham's. And then on the right-hand side, that is the Australian Agricultural Company. And Richard, when I was talking to him about this slide, said that when this slide came out, he received a call from AACO that said, how do we get ourselves from the right-hand side of the graph to the left-hand side of the graph and making ourselves more attractive to investors? So this is really going to, I think, going to become a much more of a driver within this whole chain, and understanding this is going to be important. And then moving on to on the left-hand side there, a media release from Rabobank earlier on in the year. I've highlighted a couple of paragraphs in there. The top one is reporting companies. So going back to that, reporting to APRA, the climate report, risk-related reporting. Reporting companies are expected to increasingly look to source relevant activity data from their supply chains to improve the accuracy of their Scope 3 measurement over time. And I'll come and explain Scope 3 a little bit later on. And then the Scope 3 measurement and reporting will become much more widespread, and reporting companies will likely develop engagement strategies with suppliers, including agricultural producers, to source relevant data. And these strategies could involve providing education, training and support to suppliers. They could involve requiring suppliers to set their own science-based emissions reduction targets, and they could see the introduction of requirements to provide emissions data. So that was a press release from Rabo on their website. On the right-hand side is NAB's in their sustainability statement along a similar line, and just highlighting that they've got a farm ID map looking at emissions data across the country and relating that back to credit risk reporting. So the financiers are starting to look at this and expect in the next couple of years that is going to filter down through the supply chain to producers around supplying emissions data. And for me, this is probably one of the critical ones, is that your emissions data has value. You have value to, or potentially value to, these multinational companies' balance sheets and their annual reports. And the question you should be asking is, once you've got that emissions and data, is what value is it to the person that's requesting that data from you, and what value can you extract for it? So that, for me, I think is a big one. There are also the MLA CN30 targets, reducing emissions there. So the industry have set some standards as well. But for me, much more than that is as producers, we're dealing with a changing climate. And so I would say that I'm not interested in your politics around climate change, what's driving it or not. What I say is, we know that it is changing. You're dealing with it every day. And how do we, as a agricultural business, react and respond to that change to maintain profitability? So a slide here from some work done a couple of years ago now for the southwest corner of WA, showing that up to 2030, the growing season rainfall from April to October is going to decline, especially in those eastern areas, moving more towards that southwest corner. And a very similar slide for temperature, that we're going to get hotter. Excuse me. We're going to get hotter, and it's going to become more challenging just to farm in these areas. So our practices are going to need to adapt. And then from rainfall chart in here in WA, just the annual rainfall. This is one of my clients from the early 1900s through to 2024, showing just variability from median, that they deal with a very variable rainfall pattern. But then if we move that to a rolling 5-year average, we get to see a much more discernible pattern that over the last 20 years, 25 years, we have had a very much a drying pattern, and we've lost that rainfall. So how does he as a producer adapt to that climate, and what changes is he going to make? So really for me, why should a producer want to be involved in carbon farming and emissions? For me, it should be treated like any other production system, production decision. Is another production enterprise. There are costs and benefits, and you need to weigh up whether that has value to you or not. There's financial benefits. There's increased sustainability, both from an environmental perspective, but also diversification of the income. Making best use of land uses, using areas that probably should never have been cleared, or areas that are unproductive or lower production, and putting those into a higher value land use. And there's the co-benefits as well from shelter belts within a livestock system, and reducing that wind effect. There's also some opportunities, but also risks from a succession point of view. And then there's just lifestyle, personal interest. It's the right thing to do potentially. So for me, to start with, carbon emissions, you hear the terms scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. In the middle there, scope 1 is everything that you control in your production system, farm gate to farm gate. So these really you can control diesel emissions, emissions from your livestock, burping, the methane emissions, the enteric fermentation, and then emissions from the use of fertilizers, chemicals and purchased feeds on the farm. So those are scope 1. Scope 2 are your energy emissions, so your use of electricity being brought onto the farm. And then scope 3, pre-farm gate, is fertilizer inputs, chemical inputs, purchased feed inputs, and if you buy livestock in, then the producer's emissions from that farm as well. And then you've got your downstream emissions, which is scope 3 as well. So transport to the processor, and then from that through into the retail store. So everybody has scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. If you are a Coles supermarket, majority of your emissions are upstream, scope 3, from yourself. So you look at the processor and say, I'd like you to supply me a carbon neutral product. And the processor will then look at their producers and say, can you produce a carbon neutral product for me as well? About 60 to 80% from a agricultural producer's perspective, 60 to 80% of their emissions are scope 1 that they can control within their own program. So, wrong one. Within current carbon calculators, these are some of the main ones. The one that I use within my business is the Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, PICCC, University of Melbourne calculators. They're Excel based. There's a separate spreadsheet for each calculator. They update them on a regular basis, so you have to keep going back to the website and checking, but it's the one that we use within my business. Another one, AIA, Environmental Accounting Platform I like, is a online version of the PIC calculator, and an easy to use format. There's a number of private companies as well that use the PIC calculator as their base. Siro have a farm print that's still in development, hasn't been publicly released. And then an international calculator that a lot of the multinationals use is the Cool Farm tool. Has a high level of detail. It's online. Not necessarily at this point in time consistent with the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory methodology, which the PIC calculators are more aligned to. There are some differences when you're comparing calculators, but as I said, my preference is the PICCC one. And then on the right-hand side, the look-see That's if you're looking at what sequestration we can obtain from an emissions reduction method, so a soil carbon methodology or replanting some vegetation. The AgriCalc is a University of Melbourne calculator I looked at a couple of years back just to see how it compared to PICCC and the Cool Farm tool. There's some significant differences there. And then the FullCam, that is the federal government's calculator for calculating emissions or carbon sequestration from registered carbon projects. So what do these look like going forward? So here the top picture there is just the data entry page from the PIC calculator. You ask some areas, livestock numbers, weight gains, feed inputs, and those sort of questions, which as producers you should all have at your fingertips anyway. And then the bottom picture there is just the results page that come out of that and give us our scope 1 in the blue there, scope 2 is green, scope 3 is the more reddy colour, total emissions by type. And then the AIA environmental accounting platform, very similar approach in terms of a sort of a spreadsheet layout there on the left hand side, and then their results output at the bottom there, which is more graphical than the PIC calculator. So whether you take your information in pictorially or via tables, yeah, maybe to choose. I really have no preference to the two. So the results, and this is out of the report that I do that we pulled straight from the PIC calculator, starting with the scope 1 emissions with your carbon dioxide, CO2, CH4, methane, and N2O, nitrous oxide, then down to your scope 2 emissions and scope 3s and the totals. So we can look over a period of time how those emissions are changing based on management practices, practice changes, those sort of things. You'll see CH4 enteric, which is, what is that, the sixth one down from the top there, the high number, which on average, 5-year average is in my client here is just under 2,700 tonnes of carbon dioxide emitted total for his business. Fluctuates from year to year. That depends on his retention of livestock from one year to the next based on the market and what the market's doing. So we can really track that through over time and supply that data to anybody that requires it. We have also produced that on a graphical format, so out of the results up there, the big dark blue box at the bottom is the enteric emissions, so feed efficiency, that sort of thing is 65% there. So what I'm going to be looking at doing is how quickly can I get weight gain onto the animal, how quickly can I turn them off the property, and the shorter length of time that I can keep them on the property, the lower those enteric methane emissions for my scope 1s are going to be. So I'm really a sort of a reward for effort type of person. So this really very graphically gives a very quick picture of where best to allocate my resources. From the right hand side, really starting from that big lighter blue box, fertilizer emissions 14% there. Anything to the right hand side of that are your scope 3 emissions, so looking at how we can reduce those. And in this example, the electricity in the middle there is actually a very low percentage. It was 0.02%. So if my client came to me and said, Richard, I want to invest in electric tractors, that sort of thing, my response is going to be, is that a best use of capital, or should we be better looking at that feed efficiency and converting that feed into protein? And just for an example, this is a crop one, just to give you an example of where the differences come from. The bottom chart there is a conventional producer their big emissions come from really fertilizer, so they focus on fertilizer use efficiency. The top chart there is for a producer that has very low levels of fertilizer input, and his changes there. As you can see on the left hand side, fuel becomes a major component. So if he comes to me and says he wants to invest in an electric tractor, that starts to add up from an emissions perspective, from a dollars point of view. So from an livestock emissions intensity, so intensity, two numbers from a carbon emissions point of view. You have your total emissions for your farm. That was the big number that we saw on the table previously. This one now is looking at how many kilos of emissions do we have per kilo of live weight turned off, and really starts to allow us to compare against between different producers and production systems. So for this client here, in the middle one, if I look at the meat column in 2nd of January 2024, when we took this, his total emissions were 4.38 kilos for every kilo of live weight that he turned off. And in 2025, that was 4.9. And really the big change was the enteric methane change, went from 3.72 to 4.19. He retained a mob of sheep from 1 year to the next because of the market prices were low. Columns on the right hand side are for his wool production, where in 2024 we were looking, or 23, sorry, because it's 24 date, we're looking at just under 21 kilos of carbon dioxide emissions per kilo of wool, and in 24 that was 21 kilos. So really not much change. A little bit of change in the enteric methane, purely because he'd retained those sheep on farm. So when we can now start to compare those emissions intensity across livestock. So left-hand column there is sheep meat. The average is sort of sits around about that 7 kilos per kilo of live weight turned off. Wool sits at about 26 kilos per kilo of wool produced. Beef at just under 15, around about 14 kilos, and then dairy beef down at around 4, because they're turning those animals off a lot sooner. So really highlighting, again, the speed. If we can get weight gain onto our animals and we can turn them off quicker, then we can really sort of start to look at making some improvements, both in emissions reduction, but also in terms of production efficiencies as well. And just for a comparison there, the crops, wheat on the left hand side, about 240 kilos per tonne of grain produced, and yeah, kiwi fruit, potatoes on the right hand side, so really higher emissions per tonne. We can then, a complex side, but I'll walk you through it. I can calculate if a purchaser, processor came to you as a producer and said, I want you to supply me with a carbon neutral product as of today, and you had to go to the marketplace and buy those carbon credits. Sorry. If you had to go to the marketplace and buy those carbon credits, on the top line there, when we were looking at this, the value of the ACCU, $16.55 in 2024, $38 in 2025, so almost doubled in price. And if we had to make the business carbon neutral, that was going to cost us $79,000 off the bottom line in 24 and $195,000 in 25. We can then make that calculate that on a cost per kilo basis, what we would need. So I'm going to take you down to the emissions per kilo turned off there. And from a sheep meat perspective, in 2025, to be carbon neutral, we'd need another 20 cents a kilo in order to, if we had to go and purchase those carbon credits from the open market. And if we were to do that with wool, we'd need another 80 cents a kilo in order to justify doing it. So this is where really I can start to put a value on those emissions and value towards from a producer perspective. Moving through, I've got a couple of slides here. I'm not going to go spend too long on them. There are abatement options for reducing enteric methane, fermentation, manure management, and nitrous oxide emissions, and then fertilizer management as well. So for me, a lot of these are around production efficiency and improvements in management and profitability of the enterprise rather than just an emissions reduction. I'll skip that one, don't want to talk about that one. So in terms of changing management practices, not all management practices will have an impact on sequestering carbon or reducing emissions. This one taken from the MLA Carbon Accounting Technical Manual, showing that fallowing doesn't contribute a lot to increasing soil organic matter, but pastures and pasture species within your mix has one of the highest practice changes for increasing that organic matter. Moving quickly to the future, a lot of these organisations now have changed their focus from asset prices and really global risks, and now are focusing more on climate related factors and risks to their businesses from an environmental point of view, biodiversity and all of that sort of thing. And AWI has a Woolmark Plus program with 13 metrics that they look at and focusing on nature positive farming practices in setting programs, and suggest if you haven't looked at that, you really need to have a look at that and get abreast of where AWI is looking for right now. And so just wrapping up, opportunities from carbon emissions profiles being involved in this space: land use efficiencies, landscape rehydration, I talked about the shelter belts, water use efficiencies from pasture production, fertilizer and chemical use efficiencies, improving livestock production efficiencies and the pasture efficiencies, energy use, the financial diversification, and giving you a choice within your supply chains. So for me, I look at all of those and go, is this about reducing emissions, or is this just about making our enterprise more productive and more profitable? Because a lot of the practices for reducing emissions, as an advisor to producers, I'm saying if you're not already doing them, why are you not already doing them? Ooh, wrong button. As with every enterprise, there are understand the risks, commodity price movements, so the carbon price moves on a daily basis. You don't achieve the physical outcomes that you've said you're going to achieve. Market access, cost of finance, and I think that's going to be a big one going forward, that if you're a high emitter, then you're potentially likely to attract a higher interest rate than if you're a low emitter. And being aware of players that come and knock on your door and saying, we can help you reduce your emissions, or we can buy credits from you if you do X, Y, and Z. Just have a look at whether they're conflicted in that space or not, because I've seen some very poor agreements from a producer perspective. It's still a work in progress, emissions calculators. There's some media reports this week around feedlots and emissions from feedlots. My answer to people saying, well, we're going to wait until calculators are 100% accurate, or we understand this space, is we're going to be waiting a long time if that's what you're after. And if you want to make changes to calculators and be involved in the conversation, you've really got to know what your numbers are and where the limitations are within the system. And your carbon has value. Your emissions number has value. Think about who's recording it and collecting your data and how they might use it. And once you've got that number, you can control the narrative. You can control who's got it, why they've got it, and what they use it for. And then know how it relates to your neighbours and your peers. And do the rewards match the risks? And finally, for me, your data can be used for advanced client management, enhanced risk assessment, and adjusted loan and premium pricing from your supply chain. So be aware who you're giving that number to. And that, Georgia, I think does me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Richard. Amazing how you were able to simplify some really complex topics there. So I really appreciate you breaking it down for us and helping us get started if we haven't already. A couple of questions have come through in the chat, and I'll take more once I've answered these if anyone else wants to shoot some through for Richard before we move on to Bruce. The first one's from Emily. The AIA calculator is still pretty cumbersome to use. Thinking entering chemicals applied by active ingredients, not brand names. Is the pick any simpler with those sorts of constraints?
We find it simpler. Yes, in terms of chemicals, it asks for just one active ingredient number. You've got to work it out on a previous spreadsheet, but you just go and enter one number in. We've done a few of these over the years now, so we have an idea of where that number should sit. I go back to being a reward for effort type of person, and if nobody's paying you for the number at the moment, close enough is good enough.
Terrific, thank you. And how do emissions get allocated for when an animal is meat and wool production? How do they make that split?
Oh, good question. So within the PIC calculator, there is an allocation. You're going to test my memory now. Can't remember off the top of my head. There is a split in the PIC calculator to split between wool and meat side of things. I can't remember off the top of my head what that is.
No worries. I think we can all agree that today is a great opportunity just to get started. And if a lot of people are going to start downloading the PIC calculator after this and diving into it, hopefully a lot of these things become clear as you start working your way through it. Another question.
So that's one thing I like. That's one thing I like about the PIC calculator is you can go and have a look at the factors that drive those calculations and the results, and you can go and have a look at where they've got those factors from and how the calculations are actually worked. Whereas the online calculators don't let you have a look at those factors and the backroom calculations.
Terrific. Yeah, I must admit, when I dived in there, I was like, this is actually quite intuitive. You just got to not get too overwhelmed when you first open it up. Another question is, how often do you recommend doing an emission calculation? Obviously, data varies from year to year and changes in climate and seasons and yields. So how often do you recommend doing these?
Once a year, when you're doing your annual business review, the information that's required for the calculators, if you use a consultant, your consultant will be collecting that information anyway and putting it into the business review. So there shouldn't be too many additional questions that they need to ask you. So once a year, definitely. And looking at how the season's changed, rainfall has impacted that, management changes, all of those sort of things.
Terrific. If anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question, now is your time to shine. Otherwise, we'll move on to Bruce, and Richard will hang around for a little bit longer and might be able to take a few more questions later, time permitting. But yeah, you might be able to keep an eye on the chat too over the next 10 or so minutes. So appreciate your time again, Richard. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Georgia.
Now we're going to move on to Bruce Pengilly of Penrose Pastoral from the Esperance region of WA. Bruce, are you able to turn on your camera and come off mute when you can?
We should be good to go.
Hooray. I'll let you take it away then. Thanks so much, Bruce. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Too easy. Thanks, Georgia, and thanks for the opportunity for AWI Extension to tell us, tell you how we've managed to do it and where we started from and all those sorts of things. So what you see there is a picture of everybody bar our daughter-in-law, Courtney, who helps out on the farm. So you got my good self on the left-hand side, the brains of the operation in the middle of Thomas. I'm sure many of you have seen him round about in different committees and whatnot that he's been on. And the one that keeps us all sane and in line is my wife, Trudy, on the right there. So we started in 1978. Mum and Dad bought this property. We were the second tranche of those coming from South Australia to invade this state. And we moved over in 1979. So we bought another property in 1981, which gives us a total of 3,900 hectares. So of this, we had to clear about a quarter of it. And that ranged from standing mallee to stuff that had been previously burnt and chained and we had to start raking that and pushing it up and whatnot. So these days we crop about 2,200 hectares, and then we've got about 1,350 which is pasture. And we finished doing that clearing in the early 90s. So that came about when the Ag Department put out the word that there might be a moratorium on land clearing. So I actually hired the neighbour's blade plough and we got stuck into it. But at the same time, we still had to leave 10% of remnant veg. So as you can see from that satellite photo on the right-hand side, that's our top block up on Grass Patch West Road, and that was the last country we cleared. And on the left of that is, we've left all the creek lines, we've left all the swamps. There's a little bit of salt in there, not a lot of rock. But on the right-hand side, that was already done by the previous owners. He's left shelter belts and a few creek lines, and once again the swamps. And while that's given us good cover for the sheep and so forth, it has made it very difficult because any of the unarable land now has bush on it. So it's not as though we can go growing extra trees and starting a project and stuff like that. So Mum and Dad retired in 2010, which left the four of us, once Thomas was married, to carry on the business. I started looking at the carbon side of things, I guess, as a bit of a relief. I'm into the quality assurance. We've stepped up with the CBH quality assurance, and when that fell over, we've now been, the whole farm's independently got a quality assurance program. Just recently, we've done the SWN, and I've just finished doing Authentico, and that's where Trudy brings me into line. She goes, how many different quality assurance programs you need? Part of this was, there was a lot of talk about carbon farming. So I think it was about 15 years ago, we went to a seminar in Esperance, and there was all of 6 of us in the room, including the presenter. And about halfway through, he said he's had guys walk out, they've got better things to do, like fencing. Well, I made it another couple because we just couldn't see any point of it. If you already had the trees growing, you couldn't start a new project. If you're already doing a lot of the stuff, you know, a project wasn't viable. So we walked away from it. So it wasn't until 2022, you hear whispers of our federal government looking at a carbon tax, following on from what New Zealand had done. They were looking at a methane carbon tax. And it was about the same time that New Zealand had stopped mulesing. And the government over here thought that was a very good idea. We'll try that too. So I thought I'd better find out what's going on, because just in case they did bring that in. So A Sheep had a chat to us, and which happens to be one of the best little organisations in the southeast. If you're not a member or you know, don't get hold of the newsletters, I suggest you do. The good little outfit. So they got funding from MLA to be part of the CN30 project, which is carbon neutral by 2030. And I just highlight here that that's not as an individual business, that is agriculture as a sector. So don't get all up in arms if you don't think you can manage it yourself. We're looking at it as a whole group. Anyway, we've put our hands up to that to be a PDS. So our area of focus was livestock age and weight and how this would affect our carbon output. So our first calculator was done in 2023 using the SBGAF tool. And like Richard highlighted, it's relatively easy to follow your way through, but we have found over the years that there are a couple of things that when you put in your livestock, it has your maiden ewes, your lambs, your maiden ewes, but once they get over a certain age, there's no further calculation to say if she's a terrific old ewe with 6-year-old and she's had 10 lambs and everything's hunky-dory, or she's been one of those that slid through and she's 4-year-old, she's given you 1 lamb. So that is slightly missing on it. But it's relatively, like I said, relatively easy to work your way through it. And of a side note, in 2024, when we did our budget review, we're with Rabobank, and our manager asked whether we're aware of this calculator, and yeah, we had been, we looked into it. And it was not long after that again, Nutrien asked the same question. So it just reiterates this feeling of this stuff is coming. Just make yourself aware of it because it is coming. In the initial calculation, because we didn't know any better and we thought it was a good idea at the time, we put in the crop, we did everything. And your head's just spinning. So when you first open up the calculator, like Richard said, don't be overwhelmed with it. because I think there's about 20 pages. If you like Thomas and a bit of a nuffy on that stuff, he's got into the background, had a look at it all and figured around and started trying to change stuff. Whereas I go, I want an answer at the other end, put it in, let's see the bottom line. So we started with the initial data and just follow it through. Like you said, it's fairly intuitive, so you can just work your way through it, but try not to get caught up in what I call the small stuff. Like trying to work out how much glyphosate you use to do the spot spraying, how much electricity goes into the generator when you're up the paddock trying to do something. Stuff like that, you'll find in the end makes very little difference to your bottom line. For instance, we use a good 12 tonne of calcium sulphur mix here. And while your urea blocks is accounted for, this calcium sulphur isn't. So you just get little discrepancies like that. So yeah, like I said, try not to sweat too much about it. It's not that difficult. And we've found a bigger influence on your bottom line is getting your livestock numbers right, your body weights, and an increase, decrease in live weight correct. And this made it a lot easier for us. We bought a Tapari similar time, sort of 2 years ago. So rather than just go through and if you're doing the drenching or just doing whatever you need to be doing, hook up the scales to give you a more accurate weight. Because at the time, I just first put in, we had an average of 90 kilo ewes, and we used to have some thumpers and they're 100 kilos. So that was one of the first things we did was take them out of the system, but then we got a more accurate grasp on what our sheep actually are. Anyway, at this time I'd like to mention our sponsors, AWI, because as the growers of the best fibre in the business, you actually get to extract a bit or subtract a little bit of carbon because your wool gets put into that. And 48% of wool is actually carbon. The other change I think we'd probably make is currently I do the seasonal calculator. And if we get the opportunity to do a monthly one, we'll probably change to that. This being for the fact that if you sell lambs at the beginning of the quarter, they're held in the system until the end and the beginning of the next quarter. So you're actually, it looks like you're hanging on to them for longer you actually are, therefore emitting more methane. So just drag that back a bit. So once you've put all your data in and you're just chuffing along quite nicely, your things are all groovy, you can get to go to the results, which is this one. And I suggest at this time you go and get a drop of your favourite beverage because it starts to do your head in. When I first pulled up this pie chart and saw just how big that blue area is of enteric methane, you just, what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with this? What, it's huge. It's too much. Anyway, in 2024, I also had the privilege to hear from a lot of speakers from CSIRO, most of the universities across Australia. And at that time, the big thing was Asparagopsis. But to me, what we found was livestock in a confinement area, they'd eat it. But once they were let out into pastures and other areas like that, they wouldn't eat the stuff. So therefore, they're not going to affect your methane emissions. And at the time, the other thing was that they couldn't agree, like the authorities couldn't agree on how many livestock were actually out there. So they don't know how many livestock are out there, how much methane is emitted. So you start to think, well, not everybody's got the answers. Not everybody knows what's going on. So don't panic. We're all in that boat. And that's one of the things I've realised very quickly with this, that it's the goalposts are always changing. They're continually moving. But if you do get the chance, put your hand up to be a part of some of these trials. Because if nobody does the trial work, nobody's going to have the answers for us then to use. So the more correct we can get with those answers, the better trials we have, the more we're going to know, the better this whole thing's going to be. From what you can see there, at 23 emissions have dropped to 25, but this is a wee bit deceptive because in the year from 23, I wasn't allowed to put in those trees you saw in that aerial photo because back in the day, the government claimed it all. So we thought, well, we can't put that in the system. It's, we're not allowed to do that. But talking to Richard this year, and we had big fire in 2015, which burned all that country. So it's coming back. It's been 10 years now, and it's slowly coming back. And we said to him about it. He said, oh, yeah, you can put that in. So all of a sudden, there's 130 hectares of actively growing trees, which is that little bit on the bottom. trees were the main contributor to the reduction, but that's simply because we're allowed to put it in, or felt we could put it in. We possibly could put half those trees into the cropping side of it, but when you look at it as a total farm thing, they get spread out across there anyway. There's a minor downturn in our methane emissions from 866 units to 752, which comes from more accurate body weights. Like I was saying before, we now, when I first did it, we had 84 kilos, we're now to 79, and I'm pretty confident that those figures are correct. And probably the biggest difference is from 23 to 25, we've actually destocked due to lack of water. We've had a couple of very dry seasons, haven't had the runoff. So our U numbers have actually gone from 1,800 back to 1,400. And you soon work out that the simplest way to decrease your methane is simply get rid of the sheep. And that would be the alternate to the whole thing. If you want zero, just don't have livestock. But we're not going to do that. That's not what we're about. So conversely, the more livestock we have, the more methane we have. And it was at this point that Richard got through to me that it's not necessarily about the total picture, but how efficient you can be, more bang for your buck. It's all about the emission intensity. So therefore, if you act on the stuff that makes you the money, you then get to do all the cool stuff like planting the trees and doing all that sort of stuff. But there's no point in cutting back. If your country needs lime, put it on. It's going to make you more money. So going to allow you to grow more pastures, grow better crops, although it will affect your total emissions. You still got to do it. That's what makes you the money. And currently our sheep are 6.9 kilos of CO2 equivalent, so within Richard's recommendation of 6 to 10. So out of all this stuff, we decided to dig a bit of a hole in a certain patch, and you can see on that photo, that's just our soil profile in one of our paddocks. So you can see the carbon up the top, a bit of sand, a bit of gravel, and then there's clay underneath, but you can see the roots don't go down very far. So, but the biggest thing that probably got me started, I got very frustrated initially. I actually used to lose sleep over this stuff, don't anymore. And one of the simple things was that I used to think of it as a benchmark, starting point. And I think it was Jan Clausen who said, no, if you think of it as a carbon profile, it's just continually changing. And that just resonated, it clicked with me. So away we went. So those are the points I've made about the silver bullet. Nobody's got all the answers, and get more accurate figuring your calculator. Now I've got down there, do not sell your Australian carbon credit units or your ACCUs. That's entirely up to you. If you feel as though you can and you want to make some money out of it, great. But the bit that worries me is because everything keeps changing, you never know what the future's going to bring. And if you've sold your carbon credits, they're gone, or they're locked up for 25 years and you're not going to get them back. So personally, if I was to get a project up, I would not be selling my credits. So what we've got there is some mapping and soil samples from our farm was mapped in 23-24 using EM38 and Gamma. Interesting stuff. You can spend hours on this. Thomas loves it, sends him down all sorts of rabbit holes, like he says. But you can see from there we've got varying different soil types. The one on the top is mostly clay, very compacted. You can see some roots. I think it's down about the 70 centimetres down. You can see a bit of root, but that's probably from old trees, old bush. So we've got a bit of compaction happening there, which is limiting our pasture production. On the bottom sample, you can see a bit of carbon at the top. That's that darker area at the top. But the rest of it is gutless sand. So that was taken just a little bit away from that previous soil trench that we dug to see what was there. So the multicoloured mapping on the side is our home farm, the one we live on. And that is a Gamma map showing our soil carbon. So the darker areas is 1%, down to those yellow and reds of the sandy stuff. There's just nothing happening. But the biggest thing with this is EM38 in relation to sodicity is quite accurate. Like it's 0.7 accuracy. So that's the maps we use to do our gypsum spreading. Whereas this one, which is a Gamma in relation to organic carbon, the relationship is 0.2. So really there's not a lot there. So it's not all that accurate. So not only is it hard to get your carbon down to depth that we need for sequestration, it's also pretty hard to measure. In amongst all that, rather than just concentrating on nitrogen and how much nitrogen we're putting on, we're starting to now look at the trace elements so that once again we're getting bang for buck. We're putting on what the crop or what the pasture requires to give us a better end result. So this sort of leads us to what we're doing at the moment and what we've planned for the future. So like I said, we're concentrating a little bit on our trace elements. So more, not necessarily more nitrogen, because we mainly use Flexian. We don't use any urea at all. In the cropping cycle, the Flexian is actually banded, so we're tying it up as quickly as we can. So keeping in mind, we don't intend to wait for benchmark. Well, we've already started this, so that day one's already been and gone, so consider it as a profile. The next thing is our gypsum application. And for us, that's the first thing on the budget. The bank manager loves to see it there. We've actually gone from when I started doing it quite a few years ago now, I thought 1,000 tonne over the season was plenty. Anyway, Thomas decided we could ramp this up. So quite often we'll do 3,000 tonne of gypsum in a season. And we've gone from 2.5 tonne to the hectare. He did do some trials up to 15, which made it look a bit like a beach, but we've done several applications and spots. We're still doing it blanket. We'll probably get to that variable rate shortly. But some have had 3 applications, so they're talking up to 12 tonne or more. But what that's allowed us to do is we now get that root penetration. Soils are much more friable. The moisture gets into it, and we've consequently growing better crops. So last year we had, I think it was about 150 mil in the growing season, still averaged 3 tonne with our barley and a bit over 2.5 for our wheat. So this stuff's achievable. So once again, that is all about getting more for less, bang for your buck, putting the gypsum on so we get better yields, decrease your intensity. So we already use minimum tillage and we retain our stubbles, like we haven't burnt stubbles for quite a few years. However, I think our soils still aren't ready for no-till. I still don't see a disc system just yet. We tend to use more legume-based pastures these days, and that photo was supposed to be a bit of vetch and a bit of medic growing in there. It's actually a barley stubble from last year, so what you're looking at is a bit of self-sown barley, and the other one is rye. So like I said before, Thomas is the trials man, and I think trial means as in try all, because my initial thing was to grow a little bit of vetch and rye on some lighter country. The next thing I look at, we've got 40 hectares and it's got everything in it, all the grasses, all the Cerridellas and a little bit of medic. Cerridella did quite well, a couple of the clovers did quite well. But what we're finding is that with these multi-species pastures, we're getting a quicker turn off. Once again, it all comes down to intensity, how quick you can get those animals off. The reason we use vetch is we've done a few trials here ourselves using cereal crops, like we've tried peas, and we did a trial, like a small plot trial with, what did we have in that? We had peas, we had beans, we had chickpeas, we had lentils. But because the weather wasn't all that good for it, we didn't get onto it, spray it and take it off. It got overrun with 2 things. One was vetch and the other was medic. So we found it's just as easy to stick to our knitting and do what you do well. And the other thing we've found, using vetch, and we've done it with a couple of pure vetch stands, the following year I've had tonne to the hectare better on our wheat. It is a simple, you know, vetch stubble, growing wheat the next year, tonne, quite easy. And we've even seen some places where the barley crop following that is still sucking up the nitrogen from the vetch. Moving on to what we do with the stock side of things, we're starting to use size with better ASBVs for fat and eye muscle. So we're now breeding a better ewe, which can hold a condition in the poor seasons, like we've seen the start of this year. And she's growing out a very healthy lamb. So we can no longer I used to just draft off those big fat ewes because you know they'd never land. Whereas these days we can't do that. And there is currently research to develop an ASBV for that, for feed efficiency and methane production. There's actually a very good article in this latest Beyond the Bale, so if you can grab that and have a good read. And if you get a chance, duck up to the Katanning, see what they're doing at Deepert up there. Go and have a look at their methane chambers and have a chat to the guys up there. Also, since the dry seasons of 17 to 19, we built a containment area on 2 properties. So we can hold 2,500 animals in that. So it's a matter of getting them off the stubbles so they're not blowing away. So we can retain that carbon. And also the sheep do so much better in them. You just cut down their walking, you keep the condition on them. So when they step out of that containment, there's more early feed in front of them, assuming it's rained and things are looking good. And hopefully your lambing percentage is increased. Not so much this year, but in the past, we've had an increase of 10% of those sheep that were in the feed, in confinement, doing really well to those ones who were just wandering around, trying to keep the feed up to them, particularly the water up to them. So while the earlier slide showed that aerial photo with plenty of trees, that was the latest stuff we cleared, so there's plenty of trees. The home block, which is the other one we saw with a variable rate on it, there's not a lot of trees on that. That was some of the original country cleared back in ELD's days. So they used to clear just about everything and then put something back if you were lucky. So we could do with some creek lines there, some swamps to be filled in to give us some better benefit and shelter for our ewes. So the farm's been fully soil mapped, which allows us to concentrate on those lesser areas, like Richard said, lift the bottom line, so to speak. So whether we need to fence them out, and we've done that with 40 hectares with what we put all this pasture and stuff on. That's a very sandy piece, didn't grow a lot. So we fenced it off, put the rye corn on it and all these other varieties on it. And yeah, there's quite a good stand there as we speak. Whether we get to adding lime, that is probably a requirement with the gypsum, putting on the gypsum, our sulphurs increased, so our soils have become slightly more acidic, but we started off with pHs of 8 and above in places, so that is not a huge one for us, but I dare say we'll get to there. We're putting on lime. And that one again, it breaks down to, calcium carbonate breaks down, you're releasing the carbon side of things, and it's going to release carbon, it's going to lift your emissions, but the bottom line again is productivity. If it means that you're going to make more money out of it, that's what you should be doing. Right, so if nothing else today, what I'd like to see you take away is just start. It's not that hard, and if you need a hand, there's guys out there, or some producers out there. Get you going, get you started, and make the change for productivity reasons. They're the ones that are going to make you money. At the moment, nobody's knocking on our door saying we're going to be charging you for all your emissions. Here's the bill. Well, you've got to be aware of it. Make the changes because you want to make them, because you going to put more money in your bottom on the bottom line. And the other one is the goalposts continue to move. As we've seen, the calculator keeps changing, the government's ideas keep changing. So if you think it's set in concrete, I think you find it won't be. So yeah, that's just about what I've got. Basically, just give it a crack. It is not that hard. I mean, if a 60-year-old bloke can have a crack at it, I'm sure anybody can give it a go. And yeah, wish you all the best.
Thanks so much, Bruce, for all those tips and for sharing all of what you guys are doing on your place. Really appreciate it. And I know Richard's still hanging around, and there's a few questions have come through, and Richard's kindly answered a few already, and I'll summarise for those of you who can't read those as well. But just to kick things off, and I know you have to bounce soon, Richard, but what are some sort of common mistakes or misunderstandings that happen when wool growers get started with calculating emissions, and how would you sort of get around those, Richard?
One of the biggest misconceptions, I think Bruce nailed it pretty much when he said when he first started, it's being overcomplicating it and overthinking it. You've already got a lot of the information that the calculators require, don't get overwhelmed with the calculators. Just make the start, work through, and the number drops out the bottom. And as Bruce said, nobody's paying you for the number yet. So I work on the basis close enough is good enough and keep refining it.
Terrific. And is the wool market starting to respond to this, or do you see it responding and other markets, lamb and meat and whatnot, to start rewarding growers in the future for doing this work?
So markets are, as I said, a lot of them are in the pilot phase. There's a lot of single product brand schemes going at the moment, so end-to-end use, right from the producer all the way through to the consumer. I know they're doing it in cashmere. I'm not sure about the wool at this point in time, but I know that there are organisations looking at doing that. And working at emissions all the way through the chain. I know within the dairy sector, 90% of producers calculate their emissions profile now, and I have heard that some of the milk buyers are paying around about $0.01 a litre for that information.
Terrific. And Bruce, for you, has working through the calculator a few times changed the way that you record your production or management data, and any tips to make it easier to draw out the right info as you go about your work?
Like I said, when we bought the Tapari with the scales on it, I mean, we've had other pieces of machinery with the scales, but we didn't seem to keep the numbers anywhere. But yeah, any opportunity when you're working with the sheep to run them over the scales, punch out a number at the other end. That's probably been the biggest one for us, because it just means there's a bit more accuracy going into it. Yeah, because prior to that, we were just guessing. And I mean, that just comes down to two, like you actually start drenching to the right way. So the side benefits of all that sort of stuff. But getting back to what Richard was saying just previously, we've been with RWS for 3 years, I think it is now. And while we haven't seen a direct increase in prices or anything like that, I think it's coming, and that's just the way we're leaning. And if we can come out the other end with an emissions number or an intensity number, it's just got to make a lot of those QA programs a lot easier to navigate.
Yeah, terrific. Now, there was a couple other questions that come through, and I'll just quickly summarise them for those of you who can't read them. There was a question around including what electricity to include from your property, and Richard kindly answered that. Is yes, basically, yeah, we do include everything in those calculations. Just go and read your meter and just pop it into the calculator. There was another question around, does the carbon sequestration in wool factor into any of the equations? And yeah, Richard kindly asked that as well. Calculators don't account for that currently, but there is debate about whether it should be, given the short length of time that carbon is held in the wool. So thanks for that, Richard. I'd like to wrap up today's session. We've gone a little bit over, so apologies for that and for the technical glitch we had earlier, but thank you for persevering with us. Once again, I'd love to thank the guest speakers today. Really, really great, insightful talks from both of you, so thank you for that. We'll let you get about your day and return to what you need to do, but thanks again for sharing. I will ask one favour for those of you who are still around. I'm just going to launch a quick poll just so we can get some feedback. We operate off feedback from wool growers like yourselves, so if you could please take 1 minute to complete that poll, that would be much appreciated. And just to wrap things up, make sure you do follow us on our Extension Network channels on Facebook, Twitter, or X, sorry. You can subscribe to our newsletter to keep up to date with all the latest. So please make sure you do that if you haven't already. I'll share the recording of this and the slides. So if you missed anything, we'll definitely be able to catch up on it later. But thanks again all for your time today, and to the guest speakers for those really great talks. Thanks all.